All right, everyone, we'd like to welcome Greg Hall to our podcast today. He's from Khorasan Mills, and it's an ancient grain company that he has here in Utah. Tell us a little bit about your company and how you kind of actually got into ancient grains and things of organic and things of that nature.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Watt. So we do have a little company here in Utah. Khorasan Mills is actually a name taken from an area in Afghanistan, that Middle East area where some of these ancient grains have been grown for years and years, hundreds of years. And Khorasan is actually the type of wheat that has a trademark now called kamut. Most people are familiar with that. It's actually Khorasan wheat. One of the really healthy variants of ancient we have now to us that we didn't have before. And so we bring these grains in here to Utah, grains like Khorasan or kamut, grains like einkorn and spelt. These are ancient varieties that people can eat when they can't normally eat other varieties of red and white wheat because of gut issues, perhaps.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so we try to be a really clean source of these types of grains here in Utah. And we bring these grains in, sell them in bulk. We can follow up with classes, our social media pages and things like that to show people use these and what the benefits are.
Excellent, excellent. So how did you get into this? How did you, did you have a store and then kind of changed into more of this? Or did you have a health issue and say, hey, this helped me and I'm going to kind of try to help other people?
I learned about health issues because I was working at a bakery, Great Harvest actually, here in Utah for many years. And I've worked at 3 different bakeries over the last 10 years or so. And as people would come into those bakeries, sourdough bakeries or bakeries like Great Harvest and others, they would sometimes ask us the questions, well, do you have kamut bread, or do you have bread with spelt or some of these other ancient grains? And the question always came up, why are you asking for these types of grains when we have this awesome bread made with red or white wheat, right? And the question was always, or the statement was always, because there's someone in my family who can't eat regular wheat.
Right.
And so we found out, this is the person talking, we found out that some of these ancient grains are more easily digested than red or white wheat.
Right.
And so I started to look into that over the years, and probably 6 or 7 years ago, I then got in touch with some millers up in Montana, Montana flour and grain specifically, and started to ask them about these grains, and kamut specifically, or Khorasan wheat. And so over the last few years, we have then partnered with mills up in Montana, up in Idaho, farmers up in those 2 states, and some here in Utah that provide these types of grains that we can then bring into Utah and then sell in bulk here this way. So I don't have a bakery. I'm really just a source for these ancient varieties of wheat that are clean, that have lower gluten, that are more easily digested by most people. And so if people have issues with gluten, they can generally turn to these varieties of ancient wheat if they want to continue to eat products with gluten and be just fine. It doesn't happen with everyone, but for the large majority of people, it's a great answer to that question.
Well, it's kind of like I've heard many people say that they can't have stuff here in America, but if they go to Europe, it doesn't bother them. And I think it's just because of, personally, I think it's because the GMO, how severely that has affected the grain industry, if you want to say. But that ancient grain is just, it's a pure product, right?
It is. And so to clarify what you just said there's so many different issues about grains and varieties of wheat and issues here in the States that don't have the same issues in Europe. So that's a great statement to make and a great question to ask. In Europe, they don't have, in fact, they banned GMO ingredients. They banned GMO products, right? And we're talking about the greater European area. But here in the States, those rules and regulations are so much more lax. And so we have many GMO products, but there are no products in the grains area that you could consider GMO. None of those have been approved here in the States. So there's no GMO wheat or anything like that. The answer lies generally in how the wheat is grown, meaning the type of pesticides that are put on the grains. So Roundup always comes up, right? Glyphosate and those types of things. And then also the hybridization of wheat over the last 60, 70 years has also caused issues, studies have shown. And so these grains that we work with
Explain what
are
you mean by hybridization.
hybridization would be the crossing of various types of plants, right? And so when we talk about hybrid wheat,
2 or 3 together to get one.
correct. And so you want certain traits within a certain variety of wheat, right? A great example of that is most people don't like the taste of red wheat, and so they hybridized varieties of wheat to remove the red bran in the wheat. So now we have white wheat, and it's a much more mild flavor. It doesn't have the harsh texture or flavor of red wheat. And so we now have a white wheat that has the same gluten capabilities of red wheat, but it's a much more mild flavor, and people like it a whole lot more. But hybridization has occurred for a variety of reasons, and others are pest control, um, um, weed control, and things like that. The size of the stalk has changed over the years so that more growth goes into the kernel rather than in the stalk, right? And so that's great for farmers who have whose goals are to have more yield per acre. So a bigger kernel per stalk, more stalks per acre. Anyway, hybridization controls a lot of those different things, right? And something has happened in the starches of these hybridized varieties of wheat over the years that has caused people to not be able to eat them. And that doesn't include all of the population, certainly. In fact, studies show that it's maybe 6 to 10% of people who can't handle these varieties of wheat, but media has published this so much that it seems like a much bigger population. The answer to this, though, is what we do. And we bring in these ancient varieties of wheat that have lower gluten, that are more easily digested, and that are pure, have never been hybridized, and so they're clean. And that's what people like.
So just so you put your thumb up to, I think, to stabilize your phone because it was shaking. Your thumb's a little bit on your camera. So you want to move your thumb just a little bit.
There we go.
No, you're still on it. There we go. There we go.
Okay. So what I want to know is if people do have some gut problems, because we do there's a lot of people that still like bread, but they can't really have it. But what are some of these varieties that you carry for people that struggle with gut problems that they could probably, try and just see how it works with their bodies?
Right. The three most popular types, and the types that we work with the most, are kamut or Khorasan wheat, einkorn, which is the oldest variety of wheat that we know of that's been probably the predecessor to any other type of wheat that we work with. The third would be spelt, and all of these are ancient grains, considered ancient varieties of wheat. There are other ancient grains like quinoa, right, and amaranth and teff and some of these others that you've heard of that are gluten-free. But when we talk about varieties of wheat, we talk about einkorn, kamut or Khorasan, and spelt. And so these are the types of grains that we can make bread with and that have lower gluten. And
Kind of tell me, because when you make bread, and sometimes, a lot of times, if you're not having the gluten in there, the gluten is a binding agent, and also it helps so that you can, these things can rise a lot better. How is it different making with these kind of grains rather than just a regular wheat that we're used to?
Right. So the comparison is always red or white wheat compared to these ancient grains that we're talking about. And red and white wheat have super gluten. And I don't mean it's off the charts. It just means that it makes a really nice high loaf of bread, right? You can get really nice rise out of red and white wheat. So einkorn and kamut and spelt, they also have gluten, just lower levels of gluten, and the proteins are different. The proteins that make up the gluten content are different. And so
right, I think a lot of people don't realize that there's lots of variations of gluten,
many variations, right?
You don't really
so
sorry,
it always goes back, right? It always goes back to the gluten in red and white wheat that people have issues with. So then we switch over. If someone were to switch over to these ancient grains, these ancient varieties of wheat, then they're getting a different type of gluten made up of different types of proteins that are more easily digested when you make something like bread, right? And it can be any type of product, muffins, pancakes. The gluten is still there. It's just in lower quantities and it's more easily digested. So it's not all about bread. It's about how you prepare your grains for your family or for those that you want to feed, so that you're bringing in cleaner, and more easily digested grains, right? And so just to finish off the answer about bread, so these ancient grains like kamut, einkorn, and bread with these, you don't get as good of a rise as you do with red and white wheat, but the flavor is amazing. These are hearty, really nice grains to make bread with. I generally mix them when I make up my bread recipes. By themselves, they taste great, but when you mix these grains together, it just changes the profile flavor of the bread and of the different products that I make, and they taste awesome. And not only that, but they're better for us. And so we can make really good bread with these, especially if we get into sourdoughs and things like that.
That's what I was going to ask you.
A lot of answers.
Is that what you kind of, because that's kind of one of the things that we've done is done the sourdough process. Because what I think a lot of people miss in the grain side of making, let's say, bread issue is that, 100 years ago, they didn't have the yeast. They used a sourdough process, and that broke down all the, what would call anti-nutrients, and it broke down the grain particle, right? So it could be digested better. Now we can just throw it in. We can
throw in the yeast.
We can throw in the yeast and we grind it all up, and that's not how it used to be done.
Right.
100 years ago, it took 4 or 5 days before you got the loaf of bread that you was started, right? Now you can do it in an hour. And
that's right.
The process, but because there's that process, it doesn't have the same it doesn't break down the proteins like the sourdough process. So are you guys big advocates on the sourdough process? Is that kind of what you tell people how to do it? Is that kind of how they do it there?
That's exactly right. And so when we sell grains to someone who wants to use them for better gut management or better health, we follow that up with classes. And so I teach classes about ancient grains. I also teach classes about how to use these ancient grains with bread. And then the third option would be to how to use these ancient grains as a sourdough process. And so we teach all of that, right? So I always look at the little adage that we have: good, better, and best. Right? Good is whole grains, better are ancient grains, and best would be bread or products made with ancient grains used with sourdough. And the reason that's the best, you mentioned it already, is that through the sourdough process, the fermentation process, the phytates or the phytic acid in the kernels of wheat or in the flour are broken down to a point where we can then use the nutrients in the grain. Phytic acid or phytates in a kernel of wheat are there to protect the nutrients in the grain. And if we make bread or bread products out of flour that hasn't been soaked for 6 plus 10, 12, 24 hours, those phytates are never broken down to the point where we can use the nutrition in the flour. And so that's why the sourdough process, that's just one, or a fermentation process in bread making is actually really good and is really beneficial to us, because then we get the full nutrition of the grain.
So one thing it is really people need to understand though is that when you are making these kind of breads, because I have done this with the sourdoughs and things like that, you do not get the rises like you get with all of these quick yeast breads, and it's harder to be able to get these really huge loaves of bread that have puffed
the big,
up a lot,
fluffy, and all that.
The stuff that we're used to is more of a dense kind of bread, but it also, like when I have like a slice of my sourdough or whatever, after you have it, it's like you get really full quickly because the nutrients are more readily available and you get filled up on it quicker. It's not like where you have a piece of bread and then want to have another one because
and another one.
because you get filled up on it very quickly because those nutrients are so available for you. Your body absorbs them and you don't really desire to have any more.
That's so true. With whole grains, that's exactly what happens, right? Our body is able to assimilate that nutrition a whole lot better and over a longer period of time, right? Mm-hmm. So the glucose goes down, and there's just so many benefits to that. Whole grains are a challenge to make with sourdough. And when I say that, it's not hard to make a sourdough loaf of bread with whole grains. It's hard to get the rise and some of the productivity that you're talking about. But that all depends on how you develop your dough. And that's one of the reasons why we do the classes, is so that people can not only understand that, these grains are better for you if you make bread, but we also want to teach you how to make a really good loaf of bread using these ancient grains. And so we don't just talk about the mix. We don't just talk about the recipe. We talk about how to develop the dough so that over time, not only does it break down the phytates and increase the nutrition and the digestibility, but you do get that really nice rise out of your loaf of sourdough using whole grains or a combination of whole grains. And we can do that. And so that's one of the fun things that I do when we teach a class, is explain to people how that's done.
So how could people like come to a class then, or
Yeah.
how,
So where are you even located? I mean, so the way we got to know Greg is he was one of the vendors at our Be Healthy Utah Natural Health and Wellness Conference. But I don't even know actually where your office is or where your location is.
So we're in Pleasant Grove, so central to Utah County, right? And so when I teach classes, I travel all over the place, wherever someone wants me to teach a class. I actually got a text yesterday from someone who wanted a class this Saturday, and if my calendar's free, then I'm happy to do that, right? And so I can go to people's homes. We've set up shop in businesses and different places. Sometimes I can go to areas that have a little theater or a room that we can go to. Everything that we do is out of our home, right? And so I don't really have access to a commercial bakery or a commercial kitchen.
Oh, okay.
But we're really flexible as far as where we need to go or where people want us to go for classes. So we go all over the state. I've taught in St. George and up in the Salt Lake area, and all over the place that way. So it's not a problem for us to meet you or to meet somebody else for a class. And typically what happens is neighbors get together, they bring their family together, and they bring 10 or 12 people together in someone's home or in someone's place of business, some other building, and we get together and we teach sourdough, or we teach ancient grains, or a combination of both, or home milling, and some of those things that are actually really beneficial to how all this how this works. So we just try to be really flexible.
So a couple of questions. So when you use the term ancient grains, and I think a lot of people have heard that term, what is the true definition of ancient grain? Because like you said, like the einkorn wheat, that's one of the oldest grains there is. But how many different types of ancient grains are there, or is there just a few types available?
So when we talk about wheat, there's 3 or 4 or 5 specifically that we always mention, and that always fall into that category.
Right.
And that's why I'm always mentioning einkorn or spelt or Khorasan or kamut wheat, right? Emmer would be another one. So there's 4. Those are all varieties of ancient wheat. Okay. And the reason they're ancient is because A, they haven't been hybridized, right? They've never been changed. They're pure. And they started somewhere else besides the U.S. The U.S. is a really new market, relatively speaking, right? We've only been here for 200 years. And so the U.S. market for wheat is relatively new compared to the European market or the world market. And so these ancient varieties of grains that we get, or that we now grow here in the States, came from somewhere else. They came from the Middle East, specifically around Iraq, Iran, Turkey, right? You've heard of Turkey red, maybe? One variety of wheat. Yeah. And so we're either talking about ancient varieties of wheat or heirloom varieties of wheat. Again, not so old, not 5,000 years old, not 10,000 years old, not 2,000 years old, but varieties of wheat or grains that have come from Europe mostly, that are heirloom varieties, just like an heirloom tomato, right? Hasn't been hybridized, but it tastes so much better because it came from an original source. Wheat and ancient grains fall into that same type of category. And so we have ancient grains that come from Peru, like quinoa or amaranth, that comes from South America. Teff comes from Africa. Chia seed and some of these others that are now superfoods to us, right, come from all over the world, right? And so based on their protein profile and their nutrition profile, there are dozens of them that are either gluten or gluten-free, but they're all considered ancient grains because they've never been hybridized and they've never been crossed, right? And in most cases, as for the farmers that we work with, they're also grown very clean, either organically or biologically, so that it's all clean from the start.
So do you, how many different types of grains, ancient grains, do you sell then? Like about 15 to 20 or not that many?
No, not that many. So we do sell, all the varieties of wheat that we've talked about. Right. And then we get into some of these other grains like quinoa is just an amazing ancient high protein grain. Amaranth again, teff, hemp hearts actually is one in that category. Not the same hemp that we talk about, right? That's illegal, but these hemp hearts that are actually really nutritious and from a different type of plant. Just many there. And on our website, we have a price list on our website and a list of grains that we sell there and that we have available that don't just come from one source. I think that's important because we work with different farmers and different mills that supply different types of grains because they're in different areas of the US. So Montana grows amazing kamut, right? Up in that high plateau elevation area up in Montana, southern Canada. And we get really clean varieties of red or white wheat that are organic, not ancient, but from farmers here in Utah that commit to farm biologically, which means they're not certified organic, but they still follow organic standards. They just don't have to pay or don't want to pay those fees, right? And then we pull from them. They contract with other farmers who also grow ancient grains. And so that web is actually fairly wide.
So do people can they do group buys through you, or how does that work? Do they just buy just straight through you, or can they do a huge group and get a discount? What is it, how is it you have it set up that people can get grains through you?
So the way we sell grains, we have access all of these grains a couple of different ways. So here in Pleasant Grove, people come to our home and pick up these grains either by email orders or by contacting us through the website. But we can also do bulk orders, and we do that many times during the year. A lady just contacted me last month and wanted to do a pallet order for her neighborhood. And so we took care of that. She pulled together all the orders, sent them to we ordered those grains for her, and so bulk orders are the easiest way to do that if you want bulk. We also sell by the bag, right? And so people come from Ogden, they come from St. George, they come from all over to pick up these grains.
Okay, so we figured out why it was doing that. It was on our store next. It was on next stores.
Her computer jumped to a Cafe Rio instead of.
Okay, so
all right.
Before we close, one of the things that you did at the conference was you had a milling thing that you were using, like a grinder. So tell a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the reasons I brought the mock mill, is what it's called, to the conference was because I wanted people to understand who came to the conference that it really is possible to go from farm to table when we use these ancient grains, right? And so our purpose being at the conference was to help show people not only how to use these ancient grains, that they were available, but also how to process them when they wanted to use them. So I brought the mock mill to show people how we can mill these grains fresh and then take that flour and make, I brought sourdough bread, remember, to that conference. And that was a big hit, actually, was that I could go from the mill and show people how to mill grains fresh and then give them a piece of sourdough bread that I actually made the day before or the night before with fresh milled grains. And there was a combination of ancient grains used there, as well as I threw in some white flour. Again, going back to your question, Liz, about lift in bread, right? But that's okay as long as the white flour comes from a really clean source. I don't have a problem with that. But you're right, the emphasis was ancient grains, and it was really healthy food. And it was something that we really believe in. And the mock mill is a great tool in helping people understand how they can use and process these grains. So I've taken that mock mill now. I use it as the only mill I use at home, and I teach mock mill classes. I teach people how to use the mill and how to mill their grains fresh after they buy them from us, of course. And so it just goes from start to finish, and that's what we really want to do.
So how can people get a hold of you then?
Yeah, tell us all your information so that everyone has that.
Okay, so our site is khorasanmills.com, KHORASANMILLS.com. So khorasanmills.com. Contact us through there. There's a contact link there. We also have a Khorasan Mills Facebook page and Instagram page as well. And so the phone numbers, addresses are all on those sources. All right.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Greg. Appreciate you being on our podcast and appreciate you trying to help people live in a more natural way and go back to the ancient grains instead of the stuff that we have now that is not nearly as healthy. So thanks very much for all the work you do. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
You're welcome. It's a great story. Thank you.